Sure. Hello. So my name is Annick Jensen. I'm one of the co-presidents of the New Zealand Association of Positive Psychology. And on behalf of the association, alongside my colleague, Melanie, we are from, and Camelia Petrus from the executive. I would love to welcome to our learning session our guest, Associate Professor Peggy Kern, from Melbourne University. So very warm welcome to our members, new and old, and those of us joining us from the first time. It's great to have you here. We hope that you enjoy our sessions. In the chat, from the chat, I can see that some people are joining from various parts of New Zealand and also from Mexico. Hola, and that's really great. Keep putting, please, in the chat some of the questions that where are you joining from and what drew you to today's session, because we're really attentive to people's feedback and to their interests, and we want to offer to our members exciting and up to date and what is happening in positive psychology today. So we're recording the session and we'll be uploading it in our members resource area after the session. So feel free to have your camera on or off. We usually switch off our cameras during the presentation and then switch back on afterwards when we come back and talk together. So today's agenda is Peggy's presentation will be approximately 40-45 minutes. Q&A for 10 minutes. So please submit your questions as you think of them in the chat, because we'll be monitoring them and we may not be able to address everything. So it's good to have a record and for Peggy also to know what people are thinking about and maybe address them later. Oops, sorry. So after that, after the Q&A, we will just have the wrap up, and we'll talk to you about our upcoming events. And we have, as usual, we have a very short feedback survey just to make sure that we're on track with offering you the materials that is interesting. So, okay. So the one thing that I wanted to do before Peggy starts is we have a little question to you. How will you use this learning? So if you can identify or commit to an activity or an action that will put some of the principles or one principle taught in session into practice over the next week or month. Positive psychology is all about action. So I think that this is it for this part of the presentation. I will stop sharing, and now we'll have Peggy share her presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Annick. It's a pleasure to be joining you today and share a bit of my work. I really look forward to sharing with you today. Talking today, I'm going to talk today about effecting change, a systems-informed positive psychology perspective. And really, this is an area of work that I've been working on over the past really decade. And this is the area of work that I've been leading and really putting forward in terms of rethinking how we really think about what positive psychology is, how we go about things. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which I live and work, the Wurundjeri people and who are the traditional custodians of the land. And I'd like to pay my respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation. And I extend that respect to other Indigenous people who may be present today. Disability brings a range of difficulties for both the carer and the cared for. Numerous approaches to care are available, but these often leave caregivers overwhelmed and struggling to offer optimal support. Systems-informed positive psychology suggests we need to create systems of care within a positive psychology lens. And so in this session, I really want to consider what care might look like if we're really taking a systems-informed positive psychology perspective. And so I'm going to be talking to you what I mean by systems-informed positive psychology, what that actually is, really thinking about that from how that has really developed over the past few years in terms of how our thinking about systems-informed positive psychology has developed, why it actually matters, what are some key systems terms to really be thinking about. And I encourage you, as you're listening to this, to be thinking about how does this filter into your work? What are the things you need to be thinking about? And then in the last part, I want to challenge you with some implications for practice. And I really encourage you to be thinking about what are the implications for your work, for your practice. If you do have questions, do pop them into the chat. I'd love to connect with you over these ideas, over the implications that they have for us, for research, for practice, for application, and for the world beyond. So let's dive right in. In 2021, my colleagues, Tim Lomas and colleagues, published an article talking about the 3 waves of positive psychology. A common way to describe the development of academic fields is through the metaphor of waves. And the idea of this is that we have an ocean of ideas. And so you sort of have this whole ocean that we have, and every so often you get a pulse that rises up and becomes a wave. And it sort of comes in and breaks and becomes this sort of wave of ideas. And we suggest in the article that there have been 3 main waves of positive psychology that have sort of broken in on sort of the landscape of the world. So what are the waves of positive psychology? The first wave really was the creation of positive psychology, which was a reaction against sort of the main impetus of positive psychology or psychology as normal. So beginning in around World War II, psychology became really focused on fixing dysfunction. So coming out of the war effort, there became a real focus on dealing with mental dysfunction. This was really a reaction to the war effort. And so there was a huge amount of funding and a huge amount of work that went into really studying ways to deal with things like depression, deal with things like anxiety, schizophrenia, all of your psychological disorders. Psychology became quite adept at dealing with mental dysfunction. And as in 1998, Martin Seligman, as he became the incoming president of the American Psychological Association, he challenged the field and said that there's been a huge focus on on dysfunction, but we don't actually know enough about what makes life worth living. We don't know enough about how people thrive in life. Now, he was not the first person who had said this. There were others that were focused on the life well lived, but there was not a concerted effort on this. And so the first wave of positive psychology was actually focused on looking at the life well lived. And so coming from this, in the early 2000s, you had the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program established at the University of Pennsylvania. You had different interventions that were developed, things like gratitude interventions, strengths interventions, 3 good things. You had a lot of different interventions that were developed in order to create positivity. A lot of these interventions were developed to really create positive emotion. And so it was trying to go against this, focused on the negative and bring about positive emotion in order to focus on sort of the good life. And So this was actually, there was a lot of interest in all of this. It seemed to be a sort of a change in sort of where positive psychology had been, this real focus on dysfunction. And so positive psychology 1.0 was really coming up with these interventions that, instead of focusing on the negative, were things like focusing on character strengths and building our character strengths. Growth mindset came out of that. Building our mindset, savoring interventions, gratitude interventions, mindfulness has become a very popular intervention, and a lot of evidence has shown the benefits of mindfulness, connecting with others, and we've seen over the past 2 decades, there's been a lot of evidence around these different interventions and the benefit that they've really brought to us. And so this is really what we call first wave positive psychology. And there's been a lot of benefit that we've seen through these interventions. There's a lot of programs that have been developed, a lot of interventions. There's been a lot of books that have been written, and the list goes on and on about the impact that positive psychology 1.0 has had. At the same time, there were a lot of criticisms of positive psychology 1.0 that came about. There were criticisms that it was all about positive thinking. So just think positively and things will be better. Well, what happens when you think positively and things don't get better? What happens when life is hard and you try to do these things and things don't get better? What about the dark side? Why do we have all these negative things in life? What do we actually do about that? So there was actually some kickback about the sort of the dark side of life, and how does that really enter into things? There was criticism that positive psychology oversimplified things, and sort of the complexity of life, that positive psychology really oversimplified all of this. And so then you had, and so there were unintended consequences and challenges that arose. In schools, you had schools that jumped on the idea of positive education, gaining training, adding mindfulness, gratitude, and other interventions to the classroom. They added well-being classes to the timetable. However, while it became clear that focusing on student well-being and happiness can be beneficial, it's inefficient. It's insufficient. There were well-being schools where students actually felt pressure that they were supposed to be feeling well, but they were adolescents, and they were experiencing the typical ups and downs of life. And so all of a sudden they were feeling unhappy, and they were feeling completely stressed out and completely depressed, because they were supposed to be, well, they were supposed to be happy, but they were feeling sad. And they actually felt worse because of that. So there were unintended consequences. Also in schools, something that happened were the teachers were expected to be delivering the interventions. Well, what happens when you have burnt out staff that don't understand the interventions? What happens is the teachers actually do not deliver the interventions well, and they actually undermine the delivery of the intervention. And so then you actually have teachers that were burning out as they were trying to deliver well-being interventions, and they were actually undermining the well-being of the students. And so then we actually have what was called positive psychology 2.0. People like Wong were critical to this movement. James Pawlowski wrote a fascinating 2-set article talking about what is the positive in positive psychology. And he talked about, there are some different criteria about what do we actually mean by positive? What makes something positive? He talks, for instance, about what makes it positive is it's desired over its absence. So its presence is desired over its absence. That's something that makes it a positive. It's good for more people as opposed to it's bad for people. That's something that makes it positive. It's better for more. So we can start to come up with some criteria to actually say, this is what makes it positive, as opposed to this is something that makes it negative. There were books such as The Upside of the Dark Side, which actually started to say what we mean when we talk about well-being is we're not just talking about thriving in life. We're not just talking about, we're not ignoring the negative. We're actually talking about the whole mental health spectrum, all the way from the negative side of the spectrum, all the way up to the positive side. We're not ignoring the negative side. We're just putting more focus on the positive side. We're not ignoring the negative. We're looking at the full mental health spectrum and trying to help move people anywhere up the spectrum, as opposed to just being in the negative, on the negative side. And so this is sort of the development of the field where we're starting to add more complexity to our view about things. It remains unclear some of the complexities that are there. Within positive education, it remains unclear what positive education truly is. Is it simply a passing movement, or is it something else? Is positive psychology, is it just sort of like a field that has come about for a couple decades, or is it something, is it a field in and of itself, or is it psychology, or is it, does it crosses business, it crosses law, it crosses arts, it crosses humanities? Where does it really sit? There's what are the boundaries of positive psychology? Where does it really sit? What does it actually address? What are the limits of positive psychology? What should it actually address, and what should be the boundaries of it? There's a lot of complexities there about what positive psychology should be addressing, and what are the limits of positive psychology and what it can't be addressing. And these are things that we actually don't know. And this is where positive psychology enters the world of complexity. And that's where we're sitting right now, is we're sitting in the world of complexity, which brings us to the reality of the life that we're living in. You think about the people that we work with. We have a plan. If we're going to be, working with somebody, say that we want to be improving the well-being of someone that we're working with, we have a nice plan. We're going to give them an intervention. So we go and say, okay, go do this gratitude intervention. You do this and you'll have this outcome. Sounds easy enough. And it'll improve their well-being. The reality is we give them the plan. Anything that goes wrong does go wrong. And it's complex. It's problematic. It's challenging, and it's hard. This is the reality that we're working in. This is the reality of everyday life. With Anik, I've had the honor to work in the disability space. When we're working with disability, that's the reality of life, is that every day is complexity, is the complexity of life, of working with experts, with working with the child themselves, with working with care. There's no easy day. There's no easy way of going through care. And so we actually have to be wrestling with complexity. This is something called the Sinofin framework, which is by Daniel Snowden. And it's a way of looking at community dynamics. And so it's a way of thinking about when we have sort of cause and effect relationships, how do we actually go about doing things? And so when there is a clear cause and a clear solution, then we have good practice. And so up on the top, we have a clear cause to what we're doing that's obvious. And so then we have good practice. So for instance, if I break my leg, there's a clear cause and there's a clear solution. And so there's good practice that we can follow. So I go to the hospital, I get my leg splinted, and so there's good practice that we can follow. That's simple, and there's sort of a best practice that we can follow. Then there are times where it's complicated. So the relationship between cause and effect requires analysis of some other form. And so I can understand the cause of things. So, but what is the best practice, the best solution is more complicated. An example of this is depression. So if I go to a doctor with depression, it's pretty clear from my symptoms what that someone is depressed. There are symptoms there that show that someone has depression, and so I can analyze them and say, yes, I can diagnose you with depression. But what is the best solution for them? Is it pharmaceuticals? Is it doing yoga practice? Is it exercise? Is it talk therapy? Is it pause psych intervention? There's a whole bunch of different things that we might try. So these are good practices that we can follow, and we're going to try some different things, but we're going to have to work on it in order to actually identify what is going to be the best solution for the challenge that is there. Then there are times when things are complex. In this case, there's not a real clear cause and there's not a real clear solution. We can only know the best solution in retrospect. And so we actually don't know the cause for things. And because we don't know the cause, we don't know the answer to things. This is where most of our lives these days really exists. We don't know the cause behind the challenges that we see. We can't diagnose that. And so we can only see in retrospect the challenges that we're seeing, problems that are underlying the issues that we're seeing. And so in this case, what we need is emergent practice. We need to try things out without real understanding of what is going to work. And so we have different pause psych interventions. Instead of coming in as an expert, we can say, this is what we know is going to work. We can come in and say, well, we can try this, but we have no idea if this is going to work. We can try it, but we're going to have to experiment together because this is complex. And this is something that we're only going to know in retrospect what is going to actually work. This is the world that we're actually working in now. This is true in schools. This is true working within the disability world. This is true working in our workplaces. This is true working in any of the different areas that we're working in. We are working in a complex world, and so we need emergent practice. The final one is chaotic. This is where there's no relationship between cause and effect. And this is where everything is novel practice. This is what we saw during COVID. And so this is where everything was very chaotic. We had no idea what was going on. There was a lot of novel practice. People were just trying everything, just trying to figure out some sort of stability of everything. We saw a lot of people just trying anything. And it was just sort of trying to figure out, we had people doing webinars. We had people singing with each other. We had people connecting with neighbors. We had, the list goes on in the creative ways that people were actually trying to create connection, trying to create well-being, trying to just reach out and connect with one another. It's actually would be a very interesting case study to think about the novel practices that actually came out and which of those actually could be perhaps would stick with us as we come out of the COVID pandemic. Speaking of which, an example of this is we can compare pause psych versus the SIP response in COVID-19. In lockdown 1.0, in 2020, there was considerable activity in the pause psych world in response to sort of the lockdowns. And so just looking back in lockdown 1.0, like I just was a part of the pause psych world. And it was sort of like there was all this frenetic activity. It was like we were creating webinars like crazy. We were creating handouts for people. It was all like, we need to give everyone resources of how to maintain well-being in lockdown. And it was sort of all this frenetic activity. This was all part of that novel practice as part of that chaotic system of sort of like creating blog posts, podcasts, resources, and more to support well-being. Many of these are sort of go-to things that we draw on. They were simple pause psych interventions like gratitude exercises, acts of kindness, meditation, small jolts of joy to infuse sort of like well-being into the world. And yet what was actually needed as we moved on from that was actually we needed to guide people much more towards actually sort of sitting with grief and actually sitting with life is not the life that we knew before, and actually sitting with the discomfort of life being different and kind of that sense of loss of life not being the life that we actually knew before. And so a SIP response to it is actually sitting with people in their grief and actually moving them towards life is not going to be the life that we knew before. Life actually needs to be something that is different. And what are the lessons that we can actually learn from losing the life that we had in the past? And what is the life that we want to take moving forward, which might be different from what we had in the past? So these are challenging questions and things that we don't have answers to. And these are the questions of third wave positive psychology. From this perspective, there is no one right theory, model, approach, or perspective to positive psychology. But there's sort of like this emergence that happens as sort of we sort of have this crash between sort of the challenges of the complexity of life and sort of this goodness that we in the pause psych world really want to bring into things. And it highlights the need to embrace program structures and frameworks that already exist within the environments that we work within. But also we need to do it in ways that are sitting within the structures that are already there. So it means we need to actually address the human social systems that are there and actually move forward within those and actually identify sort of what are the pathways that are actually going to move us forward with the least amount of resistance. It means that we actually have to be looking at the systems and the challenges that are there and then moving that in ways that are actually going to be taking us forward. An example of this is in work that we did as part of our team. We started looking at some of the existing paradigms that actually exist within the disability space. And we identified two main paradigms that exist within the disability space. And these two paradigms is sort of disability is a disadvantage and experts know best. And we need to actually identify those paradigms, because if we don't understand those paradigms, then we're just fighting a system and we're just moving forward as if, you know, we can make change. But if we don't identify those paradigms, then we're just putting band-aids on top of wounds that are already there. But if we actually identify those paradigms, then we can actually start to change the narrative to actually effect change at a deeper level. So if we can actually identify the paradigms that are there, then we can actually start to work at a deeper level to effect change at a deeper level, as opposed to just superficially changing some of the strategies that we might otherwise just start to work with. So coming out of this brings us to the area that we've called systems-informed positive psychology, which explicitly incorporates aspects of system sciences into positive psychology theory, methodologies, and discourse to optimize human social systems and the individuals within them. Relatedly, systems-informed positive education explicitly incorporates aspects of system sciences into positive education practice and pedagogy to cultivate optimal learning environments that bring out the best in each individual and the school community as a whole. So one is in the general, the other is in the school. Now, what do I mean by systems? A system is a set of things that are interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. Systems can range from very small in size, such as, like our body is a system. A neural network is a system in the brain, to very large, such as an entire country or a solar system. The elements within a given system interact with one another, producing a whole that is something other than the sum of the parts. Here, we focus specifically on human social systems, where humans come together to connecting in a connected way, such as schools, businesses, hospitals, nonprofit organizations, neighborhoods, the individuals within them, and the dynamics between the two. Now, often when I talk about systems, people think about, this is Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological model. So people start to think about the individual, which is part of broader systems, such as families and peers, neighbors, school systems, parent workplaces, the broader culture that we're a part of. This is one part of systems. So this isn't a very important part of systems. But what I mean by systems is more than that. Central to systems is interconnection. So we are interconnected with one another. Now, this is central to Pol Psych because Pol Psych has, relationships are core to Pol Psych. With my colleague, Dr. Kelly Allen, our work has really focused on belonging and how important belonging is to young people and to human beings in general. Relationships matter. They are crucial for our well-being. But in our systems work, it really shows that we are relational creatures and we need to be interconnected with one another. So much so that SIP assumes that human beings are interdependently coexist with themselves, others, and the environment in which they exist. Hahn has termed this interdependency as interbeing. We do not exist on our own, but because of and in connection with the systems in which we reside. The importance of social relationships appears within many Pol Psych theories and interventions. Well, they mostly focus on the interventions, whereas SIP assumes that the individual cannot be separated from the broader social systems that they are a part of. So in other words, I actually can't think about myself separate from the other human beings I'm a part of. So it's sort of like me and the relationships I'm a part of are interconnected. My actions have an impact on you, and you have an impact on me, and we can't actually separate the two of those. Second, we need to identify and be explicit about boundaries. Boundaries is sort of thinking about what is sort of like in and out of the system that we're talking about. So boundaries are fluid. And so sort of like when I'm working within a system, what are the boundaries of the system? Am I just working with the individual? Am I working with a family? And I'm working with the classroom? Am I working with a school? Am I working with a workplace? So the boundaries are important because that says we need to be listening to everybody within that system. So the system is whoever I put those sort of boundaries around is the people who I'm defining the system by. So for example, in schools, I might have the student, I might have I might have the classroom, I might have the year level, I might have the school, I might have the community. In the workplace, I might have the employee, I might have the team, I might have the department, organization, I might have the industry. So these are different boundaries that I might include. And really, depending on who I draw those boundaries around, that makes a difference in terms of who I need to be listening to. Because those are the people that I need to give voice to. Third, we need to consider our definitions of well-being. Pol Psych often presents well-being in terms of frameworks, models, or theories. Some even claim that they are empirical in nature, and yet really well-being is really, it depends on who we're working with. SIP assumes so SIP assumes that well-being is defined in terms of virtuous we-being. In other words, well-being is defined by the people that we are actually working with. It's virtuous, so in other words, it's for the good of the people within the system, and it's we-being, and so it's we together. So it's for the good of the people that are as part of that system. It's value-laden, so it starts with the values that we have, and it's we as a community come up with what our values are, and we together, based on our values, define what well-being is. Fourth, dynamics. The interconnected nature of elements within a system mean that any action within one part of the system constantly interacts with other parts of the system, which are also changing and responding to one another. Well, we might use static linear models to represent relationships. Stability and change occur in dynamic nonlinear ways. This means that we are never done. So if I change one part in the system, it has flow-on effects to other parts of the system. So in other words, if I do an intervention with one part, that's going to have flow-on effects. And we need to be thinking about the effects and the flow-on effects that has within the system. A typical approach to pause psych is I have sort of X leads to Y. So I give an intervention and I assume that X leads to Y. From a systems perspective, we actually need to be thinking about X leads to Y, but Y for whom, how, where, and when. So in other words, why? Why does X lead to Y? How? Under what conditions? For whom does it work? When does it work? Where does it work? We need to be asking these questions. Finally, adaptation and emergence. And so systems are constantly changing and evolving. Well-functioning systems evolve over time, and they emerge into something that is actually well-functioning. So a positive system actually emerges into something that is self-sustaining. And this is, I did the butterfly because that's actually a well-functioning system that emerges into something that is self-sustaining over time. So this is a lot to be throwing at you. It's a lot of theory, but what are the implications of that? First of all, listen widely and deeply. First of all, we need to listen. When going back to our disability project, what I said is when we listened to the system, we heard those two paradigms. Disability is a disadvantage and experts know best. When we actually listened to our participants, we heard two other paradigms that we could actually teach them over time. And those two paradigms were, we will start with our strengths and we got this. That's a whole different change. That's a pause psych perspective. And that's something that we could pull out by doing an intervention and then actually really listening to what came out from that. That's by listening. We need to listen widely and we need to listen deeply. So often, and I put this up. This is the elephant where the whole idea is a man takes an elephant into a blind community, and the blind men all hold different parts of the elephant, and depending on which part of the elephant the men held on to, they think it's something different. So one says it's a spear, one says it's a snake, one says it's a tree, one says it's a wall, one says it's a rope, one says it's a fan. Each one is right from their own perspective, but it's only by putting the different perspectives together that you actually see the whole story. This is how it is that we only see certain perspectives. And so often we only hear certain perspectives in our system. If we actually really want to understand what's going on in our system, we need to actually listen widely and deeply, because different people have different perspectives. And too often, there are only certain voices that have a voice. And too often, the most important voices do not have a voice. And so if we actually want to effect change in ways that are going to be meaningful and have a positive impact on the communities that we care about, we need to actually be giving voice to those that are often voiceless. It changes the perspective that we have, but it actually means that those who actually matter most, but who often are silenced, often are given the voice that they actually need to actually have a voice in the system. Also, deep listening. What is really needed in the system? Are we creating content to fulfill our own needs and be useful, or what is actually needed? My reason for this one came up through the pandemic. I noticed during the pandemic is that we were creating a lot of content, but that content was really, I think for some of us, it was actually filling our own need of trying to be useful as pause psych practitioners. Is we wanted to be useful for people, so we were creating a lot of content. And yet one thing I started to notice is that what people needed was they actually needed people to actually grieve with them. They needed people to listen to their grief of loss. And they needed people to hold space for them to actually grieve. And so that's a different type of listening. And it's still a pause psych response. And so sometimes we actually need to actually listen to what people really need and not just what we think they need. It's a hard one to know what people actually really need, but we need to be thinking about, am I only listening to what I think people need, or am I listening to what people really need? It's a tricky one to actually know, because I think sometimes our own pride gets in the way, but it's one that we actually need to really think about is, why am I asking the questions I'm asking? Is it to fulfill my own pride, or is it actually to fill the needs that I actually see in the system that I'm working in? Second, this is another one that came out in our work, is embrace simplicity. Now, simplexity. Simplicity, human systems are complex, but pragmatically, we need simplicity. And so what I mean by this is systems are very complex. I've talked a lot today about things that are probably sounding really scary and sounding really overwhelming. But what we need is we need to find simple ways to intervene in systems that are simple and then but make a big difference. So what are the simplest ways that we can intervene in the system that make a big difference? And then so we kind of chip away at things a little bit at a time. And so they make a difference, but they're acknowledging the complexity that's there. For example, schools often simplify or linearize processes for sake of simplicity. Class levels is an example of our simplification of a complex system. So each individual is marked and graded within the expectations where the child's development's learning should be. Then if the child adheres to the developmental outcomes, that they can progress to a level, or they can progress a level. The simplification process fails to take into consideration the multiple contextual factors that may be interwoven within our learning assessments. But it is a way that we've simplified things. How I like to think about it is we need to be flexible and zoom in and out like a puzzle. So when we think about a puzzle, puzzles could be pretty complex. And so what we need to do is we have the whole picture in mind. And then we need to zoom in to little parts of the puzzle and work on that little part of the puzzle. And so we work on that little part of the puzzle, and then we get that part of the puzzle right. And then we zoom back out and we figure out, okay, now I've done that part of the puzzle. Now what's the next part of the puzzle I need to work in? And then we zoom into that part of the puzzle, and then we work on that part of the puzzle. And then we zoom back out and say, okay, now I've done that part. Now, what's the next part of the puzzle I need to zoom into? We zoom into that part of the puzzle, and then we work on that part. That's the whole idea of simplicity, is we're keeping the complexity in mind, but then in our actual practice, we're working in simple ways. And so we're keeping the complexity in mind as practitioners, but in our practice, we're doing simple things. We're holding complexity, so we're not overwhelming the people that we're working with, but the actions that we're taking are simple. This is simplicity in its heart. Third, we need to build from our values. Well-being is inherently value-laden. And so when we start to think about building well-being, we need to not be assuming a certain model of well-being when we're working with people. We need to actually be identifying based on their values, what is well-being for them. And so we need to be actually defining the good life based on what is well-being for the people that I'm working with, starting with their values. What do they value? Based on that, what does well-being mean for them? And so from that, okay, this is what well-being means for them. This is how we're actually going to go about and build that. Kind of related this, I love this quote. It's a little bit dated now, but I still think it's still relevant. In the rush to get back to normal, stop and consider which parts of normal are worth rushing back to. It's sort of like coming back from the pandemic. We did rush. We started to try to get back to the normal, and I still think there's that question of what are we rushing to get back to, and what parts are we still rushing that we perhaps should not be rushing so much to get back to, things that weren't working that really we don't need to be getting back to. Fourth, enable and require responsibility. SIP emphasizes the shared and collective responsibility of well-being. As schools, it's our responsibility to do what we can to create environments that support our school community. At work, it's our responsibility to do what we can to create environments that support our work community. But people need to accept responsibility for their own well-being to the best that they are able. This means equipping them with the skills and resources that they need, giving them opportunity for practice. So rights with responsibilities is that, so often I hear in workplaces, people are just like, it's the workplace's responsibility. People are always putting blame on others, but we really need to be encouraging people. Well-being is your responsibility to the biggest extent that you are able. Is that we can help you, but you do need to take responsibility for your actions. And so we need to enable and require responsibility. We give people the resources, but then they do need to take responsibility for their actions. And then finally, consider your role. Are you an informer? How can you identify the best information to share with people? Are you a visionary? How can you identify what is needed moving forward, not what you need? Are you a researcher? How can you study human experience in informative ways while acknowledging your own biases? How can you know more directly? How can you more directly integrate with practice while maintaining necessary rigor? How can you design your studies to move beyond simple linear relationships to better incorporate complexity and dynamics of individual and collective experiences? Are you a practitioner? What evidence is most useful? When is the research useful, and when does it need to be adapted to the context? How can you feed that back to researchers? And for all of us, how can we extend beyond our desires for silver bullets and quick fixes to fully embrace the complexity of human experiences? I don't have answers to these, but I look forward to exploring these issues with you in the future as we embrace the third waves of positive psychology. So in conclusion, we have the what of positive psychology, and a systems-informed approach instills sort of an important and often left out ingredient to implementing well-being, the infrastructure of looking at complexity. And I think that's the core thing that it really does, is it really brings out this sense of looking at complexity, and that's the core of what it does. We're living through unprecedented times. In many ways, the world is ready for a pause-psych perspective, we've seen that in schools and workplaces that prioritize well-being prior to things we're just in a time that people want pause psych, but they don't need simple pause psych, they need complex pause psych. The first wave of pause psych emerged at a point in time in history when people were ready for change. There was an overfocus on the negative, and there was a need for a new paradigm. We're similarly on the precipice now, which ushers in and acknowledges complexity. I don't know what that will entail, but I'm looking forward to see what we can all create together. So with that, thank you for allowing me to present some of this today. I look forward to our discussion. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Peggy. It was really riveting. You know, the interaction of the fields that you're coming from, both social psychology, personality, and developmental psychology, actually brings a really, really interesting and powerful perspective to your theory. You know, Peggy, I think forgot to mention maybe that she is the one who coined SIP, System-Informed Positive Psychology, which is in what year? Sorry, 97? Or, sorry.
2020.
Yeah. So yeah, it was really, for me, when I read this article, it was really a turning point. And Peggy mentioned some of the stuff that we've done together. And I could address it, but first I wanted to address the one question that was asked by Charlotte. Is there currently a systems-focused approach model from a methodological perspective in positive psychology? I'm thinking of the linear reality model you've shown before and how this could show up in a systemic cyclical model. So Peggy did share some kind of
so there's a lot of methodological tools that are out there. If you wanted to follow up with me, I could point you to some of the articles on some of the tools, like the causal effect diagrams. There's some really good resources on those. Yep.
Right. In the chat window, I provided a URL to an amazing resource that Peggy and Michael Wehmeyer put together, the handbook of, oh gosh, what is the exact name?
The Palgrave Handbook on Positive Education,
yes.
Which is a handbook that we published, I guess 2 years ago now, or a year ago now. It's amazing. It has an amazing, it's 30 chapters. It's free access. So if you get a chance to check it out, there are some amazing chapters in there, completely free.
I really recommend it. I've put the link in there, but if you actually search for Kern and Palgrave, it comes up automatically. So yeah, it's an amazing resource. And it had almost 700,000 downloads. So that's, yeah. So just my experience of working with this model with Peggy, as Peggy mentioned, some of it is that it really gave us a model to look at the system in the disability, parents raising children with disability, and look for the places in the system where we could have leverage. So I'm just posting this article as well so this is what Peggy referred to before, when people thought about different mental models that they could get freed from. So yeah, I think that thank you, Peggy, it's been a really, really great presentation. Thank you. In the chat, we also posted a link to a very quick survey, event feedback, as well as the link to join the association. Now, let me see how oops, not this one. Sorry, this is my, okay. So the next the next event coming up, stranger than we can imagine. I will talk about it in a moment. And then the next event after that will be our last networking event of the year. So Peggy, I really, really thank you very much for your time and for sharing with us your insights and your, I love the simplicity idea, and it's been really a pleasure. So thank you for your time. So the next thing is, if you want to join us, there is student price and general membership. We've put the link in the chat box, as well as a short feedback. So here is our next presentation, Dr. Tim Lomas, who Peggy knows as well. Well, I actually heard Tim talk at the last IPA conference in Vancouver, and really was taken by his idea of perhaps the next frontier is talking to non-human forms of consciousness and well-being, and that I know that he sometimes talks about aliens out of space, but there's also the idea of artificial intelligence and how that's going to be affecting our future. And so, yeah, don't miss this talk, Tuesday, 7th of November. Okay, so that's the time to say goodbye on time. Thank you very much for joining today. And was there another question that I didn't address? Sophia, if there was a perfect systemic way to enable leaders to create workplaces for well-being, what tools would you give leaders to figure out how they can do that in their workplace, in their context? Oh, that's you have one last question.
Could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yes. If there was a perfect systemic way to enable leaders to create workplaces for well-being, what tools would you give leaders to figure out how they can do that in their individual workplaces?
Okay. So the first thing I would do is I would actually start with the workplace coming together, with doing coming up together with from a values perspective, identifying what well-being means for the workplace, and not just leadership identifying that, but using the workplace together to come up with what they mean by well-being, because there's oftentimes there's disagreement there in terms of what that actually means. And then I would actually use an appreciative inquiry summit in order to actually have the workplace work together to actually identify their pathways to develop a way forward to actually be creating strategies to actually be developing a pathway towards building well-being in their workplace.
Well, that sounds like a whole new learning session for next year, perhaps.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a big question. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming and joining us. And I hope that you have the great rest of your day. Bye.